Thank you, Missy. And welcome to a presentation here at the Manchester Senior Center about the South Manchester Railroad, also known as the Cheney Railroad. It has been in town since 1869, and the Land Trust often leads hikes on the railroad. It's inevitable that someone will come who's lived in town for 40 years and say, "What? I never saw this. This is the Cheney Railroad," and it goes right through the center of town. But there's always something new in history, and that's what I kind of would like to talk about today. What's new in history can be dramatic, such as carbon dating. When carbon dating came in, we all of a sudden could tell how old these bones were. DNA testing became available, and we could tell who was related to whom. With ground penetrating radar, we could discover the shape of buildings that were long gone above the ground, but were available underground. So we can discover new facts, for example, to understand more about the past using technology. And we can also learn more about the past by having a different perspective on the past. For example, 1492. This slide here shows a Library of Congress exhibit about 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue, discovered America, whereas from a different perspective, the native populations, they viewed this perhaps not as a discovery of themselves. So that's another way of looking at what's new in history. But what's new in Manchester history, and I'm happy to talk about this today, consolidation and preservation of the old Cheney Railroad, the South Manchester Railroad, including now the entire 2.5-mile route of the original historic railroad and the trestle over Center Street. You're looking at an older picture of the trestle going back to about 1920. And in this other picture, this was just taken a few days ago, where now you can walk across that trestle as part of the Cheney Rail Trail. Why should seniors, especially here, we're here at the Senior Center, well, this trail is fabulous because it's flat, it's safe, it's scenic, it's historic, and it's right in the center of Manchester. You don't have to drive to New Hampshire. There aren't any mountains on the trail. No log bridges, you know, those little log bridges to tiptoe your way across a brook. No bears, no rocks to trip on. And several options for hiking. You can choose shorter or longer walks. You can choose where to park. So seniors should be especially interested. I mentioned to Missy Rankin, who's our technical expert today, that maybe when pandemic restrictions lift, we can have a special walk for seniors to explore this trail. We won't make you walk the entire 2.5 miles each way. The unique part of the Cheney Railroad as a historic institution in Manchester, to me, it represents more than just the rail trail. It represented entrepreneurship, business acumen, and daring. This picture shows the Cheney Mills. It was the Cheneys who wanted rail transportation in the 1860s when they began to prosper. But Manchester's first railroad actually went through the North End. It was the Hartford, Providence, and Fishkill Railroad. It opened in 1849. This is a centennial celebration of the main line. And why did it go through the North End? At the time, the North End was a business center in Manchester. It wasn't called North Manchester, it was called Manchester. The Manchester station was in the North End. There were cotton, woolen, and paper mills in the North End. And there were other businesses there as well. So that's why the main line went through the North End. But by the time the Cheney silk mills began to prosper in the 1860s, they wanted a railroad as well. Here's a slide that shows you in 1838, when the mills began, they had 30 employees. 1848, 86 employees. By 1860, 135. And then 1870, 551. They were booming. The boom years went right into the 1920s when they employed 4,670 people in the Manchester area. Not everyone lived in Manchester, but most did. And considering that the population was it was under 20,000, that was a substantial percentage of the population. The mills tripled in size. This is an interesting map that is actually two parts. It's the north end of Manchester, the south end of Manchester. There's a line through the center that kind of shows you the map is not connected. You have to look at the two separate parts. But the Cheney mills were isolated from the north end and the main line. It became much more important as time went on, and they were bringing in raw materials and they were sending out finished goods. They needed transportation. From the south end of Manchester, there is no navigable river that they could send freight out to the Connecticut River, perhaps, and float it down to New York City. And the roads were quite dreadful. They did have macadam in around 1900, maybe even 1890. That's where you put down gravel and put tar on top. So there was, I wouldn't call it paving, and particularly in the spring or after the snow melted, could be very difficult to get around. Now, the Hartford, Providence, and Fishkill Railroad did build a spur in Rockville. It was a 4.5-mile spur. It went from Vernon Depot to Rockville. That was in 1863. So the Cheneys did ask the Hartford, Providence, and Fishkill Railroad, build us a spur. So we'll go from that main line in the north end, send it down to the silk mills in the south end. But no, they didn't want to do that. And so in 1866, the Cheneys themselves got a charter. They saw a charter and they received a charter and they had stock. Of course, all the stock was held by Cheney family members. You can buy one of these stock certificates, by the way, online. It's not worth anything, but it's kind of cool. So the Cheneys decided what they were going to do was to build their own railroad. And in 1869, that's what they did. These are just some side notes about railroad names. New York and Hartford Railroad chartered. That became in 1849 the Hartford Providence, and then the Hartford Providence and Fishkill Railroad. The names kept changing, but I'll refer to it as the Hartford Providence and Fishkill Railroad. That's its name in 1869. So here's an article. This is another new thing about history, at least with the internet. You can read the Hartford Courant online all the way back to 1762 when it began publication. And here is an article, May 22nd, 1869. The newspaper says, "It is perhaps not generally known that a branch railroad is being built from Manchester Station on the Hartford and Providence Road to South Manchester." So notice that the north end was not called the north end, it was called the Manchester Station. "And this is a distance of 2.5 miles. This enterprise was started by the Messrs. Cheney, who are always forward in every good work, and will be a great advantage to the public of Cheneyville. A gang of workmen is now busily engaged in laying the track, 1 mile of which is already in place, and in about a month, the road will be in running order." Imagine building a 2.5-mile railroad that fast, at best. So this is just some description of the 1869 construction. The picture in the upper left with that tiny bridge going across the railroad yards. That was the Park Street Bridge at the time, quite small. There was a lot of dirt dug out from under the Park Street Bridge to build embankments that are north of Center Street. The embankments aren't made of cement, and they're not made of stone, they're just piles of dirt. As time went by, additional railroad yard buildings were constructed and siding. There was a roundhouse. There were various storage sheds, coal sheds, oil sheds in later years, offices and freight stations. So the 0.96 miles of siding they had in 1869, that increased in later years. In 1869, it was not just freight that Cheneys were moving along the railroad. There was passenger service as well. In 1900, there were 95,100 passenger tickets sold. There were 2,675 Cheney employees at the time, and many of them commuted by the SMRR. There was a special rate for commuters, 1.75 cents per mile. In 1923, just to compare, 136,709 passenger tickets were sold. There were 4,400 Cheney employees. The average ticket price was 4 cents. The biggest number of passengers in one day was about 3,500. On other special occasions, the total might reach 3,000. So these were many people in the north end commuting to the south end. There were also, as time went by and the Manchester High School was built in 1905, you could take the trolley or you could take the Cheney Railroad. There were also programs at Cheney Hall. You might take the SMRR to go to a program at Cheney Hall. In 1881, there were 18 passenger runs a day. And this is another benefit of being able to read the Hartford Courant, or we're actually working on digitizing the Manchester Herald archives. And you can read, they put the schedule into the newspaper every day. So your timetable was published and you could look up what time it was going to come, which to me, it seems a little bit silly that you would have to know, 4 minutes later, there's going to be another train. But people were very serious about getting to work on time, and if the train wasn't running on time or there was a snowstorm and it couldn't get through, people were always very concerned. The passenger service ran from 1869 to 1933. I love this picture of the passenger cars. The Cheney Railroad actually had at least one car that was passenger and freight, but mostly freight was freight and passenger cars were passenger cars. The picture on the lower right shows Cheney Hall in 1872. And if you squint over toward the back right, you'll see the depot. That's the South Manchester Railroad Depot right near Cheney Hall. So if you were commuting to work, you would be right in the very center of the mill district, whether you worked at the weaving mill or the spinning mill or the cravat mill, the ribbon mill, you'd be about in the center there. The depot was moved a little bit northward later on. Cheney's also brought in businessmen from New York and Boston. So if they were having a big show, a silk show, or conducting business, they could take a passenger car. It was the same gauge as the regular railroad. They could go up to the main line, switch it to a locomotive, go up to Boston, collect their guests, bring them back to Manchester Station, and then have them ride back to the silk mill area, all on the same car, in the same car. There were silk shows, banquets, fundraisers, and many visitors did come via the SMRR. There were fraternal organizations would have fundraisers there, like the like a ball, they might have a dance or a concert, that the Cheneys let fraternal organizations, churches, other organizations use the hall for free because these were not commercial enterprises. They were, say, the Elks or the Episcopal Church before it had its own building. On the other hand, the Apel Opera House, which was in the North End, did have commercial programs, traveling shows, such as vaudeville shows or medicine shows. Maybe you've heard of those, where they would sell you Kickapoo Indian juice, 99% alcohol, or whatever. But the Cheney Hall didn't. They had lectures, they would have educational series. Susan B. Anthony spoke there. Presidents of the United States spoke there. It was educational, it was a community center, and it's fortunately still used today as a community center for entertainment and education. The freight service ran from 1869 all the way into the 1980s, long after the mills had closed, but they were still making velvet there after the Cheneys sold out to J.P. Stevens. The last few things they were making were velvet casket liners, flags, and ribbons. Why were the Cheney locomotives so small? Well, they were carrying silk. They were not carrying usually heavy lumber like out west when you're cutting down forests worth of trees. So they could use these smaller locomotives, and they were called yard goats because they could work in the railroad yard to move freight around, lightweight cargo like silk and like passengers. And now, of course, we have the yard goats in Hartford, named after, I presume, the yard goats in the railroad industry. So freight was still moving along the rails into the 1980s. The Hartford Courant, November 24th of 1914, ran an article, something new, yet more footage along the railroad lines. You see the picture there. It has long been known as the shortest railroad system in the United States, and for several years past has also been known as the railroad with more sidetrack than mainline. And it is also the only railroad operating exclusively in Connecticut that is not in any way owned or controlled by the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad Company. That was 1914. The years of the railroad's heyday would have been 1869 to 1929. Here's a wonderful picture. This is in the North End. This is on the main line. So if you look out behind the man who's standing there, over to the right, that's the Manchester Depot, what we would call the North End today. And over to the right in this picture, you can see a railroad that's going out to the left. It's curving out to the left, and that's the north end of the South Manchester Railroad. These are pictures of the depot. These are pictures of some of the second generation of Cheneys. A silk show there at Cheney Hall. The railroad prospered, the town prospered. This wonderful article in Harper's new monthly magazine of November of 1872 talks about an industrial experiment at South Manchester. The whole article, by the way, is on the website of the Manchester Historical Society, manchesterhistory.org, if you care to read it. The industrial experiment at South Manchester was the Cheney silk mills. And it is quite flattering of the Cheneys which, you know, today we would hope our newspapers would be more objective and not say, oh, these were such wonderful people. Harper's Magazine, a couple more illustrations from it. Of course, in 1872, there weren't as many of the mills built as yet. The Cheneys were still building into 1914, new buildings. This is a map showing the Cheney Railroad. The South Manchester Railroad operated at a profit for 64 years. In some years, it covered 16,000 miles along its 2.5-mile track. And it's right here in Manchester. It's unique. Unfortunately, the Great Depression, economic troubles in Manchester, the United States, and the world began in 1929. Additional troubles for the Cheney brothers, the lifting of tariffs. So when there are tariffs on, for example, silk goods, which were considered a luxury, you had tariffs, made it very expensive to buy Italian silk or Chinese silk. But when the tariffs were lifted, Cheney silk was no longer protected from cheaper foreign imports. The value of their inventory, what was right there already, goods that were already made, the value of that inventory plummeted from millions to thousands of dollars. Industries began moving south for cheaper labor. And silk was considered a luxury, so sales were decreasing anyway as consumers bought cheaper goods. As the Depression moved along, they weren't buying any goods. Cotton and synthetic fabrics became popular. They were cheaper than silk. Automobile ownership was increasing. Now, this isn't in regard to Cheney's, but in regard to the South Manchester Railroad, people didn't need to commute on the railroad. Even people of modest means could sometimes afford an automobile. The trolleys, they were competition for the railroad as well. The trolleys began in 1895. And commuters generally decreased because of unemployment and slacking off at the mills, which decreased ticket sales. Slacking off, by the way, is a little different from being laid off. What the Cheneys did, what a lot of businesses tried to do as the Depression progressed, was instead of laying you off, they would say, well, we're only getting contracts for this much silk. We'll let you have 20 hours a week, but you only got paid for 20 hours a week, but at least it was some money coming in. So there were cuts in silk production. Fewer raw goods were needed to come in, and fewer finished goods were going out. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation loan that was necessary for the Cheney's survival required divesting itself of non-manufacturing essentials such as utilities, employee housing, and the South Manchester Railroad. So in other words, if you're going into bankruptcy, you are going to be protected, your business is going to be protected, but your non-essential parts would have to be divested of. So for example, the Cheneys owned hundreds of houses, housing for employees. They did try to get their employees to buy the houses. Buying the houses is good for stability in your business and retention of employees. If they bought the house, they're more likely to stay there. This is a wonderful old picture of the last passenger trip in 1933. The goat train of the South Manchester Railroad is shown above just before it left the Cheneyville station on its final trip to the North End, thus completing a span of 64 years service here yesterday afternoon. In the cab can be seen from left to right Seth Leslie Cheney, fireman George M. McCready, and engineer Joseph J. Kennedy. Conductor Robert Kerr Jr. is standing on the steps of the coach. So that was a sad day in 1933. No more passenger service, but freight did continue to roll along the rails into the 1980s. What remains of the Cheney Railroad? There's not a lot of rolling stock. There is a Cheney Brothers freight car that was protected, and it's still in a museum here in Connecticut. There are people who collect, for example, Cheney lanterns. There are some Cheney Railroad lanterns around. And if you walk along the trail, you can frequently see spikes. These are spikes from the Cheney Railroad and various artifacts. And of course, I'm showing this picture from 1959, this advertisement for Connecticut Bank and Trust, long gone. Connecticut Bank and Trust Company. The advertising went right along the trestle. We still have the old map. So here's a 1911 map. This is a Sanborn map. The Sanborn maps were insurance maps. So they went into loads of detail about buildings. They wanted to know, is it sprinklered? Is there a watchman? How wide are the corridors? How far is it from a hydrant, et cetera? So the wonderful information from those old maps. The silk storage shed, that's the upper right picture. You could drive a railroad car right into that structure. It's still there. And the bottom right photo, that's our newish bridge across Bigelow Brook. Still has the wonderful view of Center Springs Park looking out from a great height. Modern times. So in 1989, Rail Line Associates, that was the name of an organization, the principals of which were Alphonse Real and Lawrence Fiano. They bought a large portion of the old railroad from Conrail. I'm not going to go into this entire history, but Alphonse and Lawrence had recommended to the town not to buy this railroad, not to buy it, don't buy it. And you know, they bought it themselves, at which point they sold an easement to the electric company. They sold an easement in various places. They then tried to sell the 10 acres back to the town. I'm not making this up. You can read it in the Hartford Courant. But they did try to sell 10 acres to the town for $400,000. I'm glad the town said no. But after 2005, the Manchester Land Trust was able to buy part of the Alphonse's family. He had died, and the family sold it for $55,000, not $400,000. It was kind of a gift, I guess I would say. And in 2008, the Land Trust bought Hilliard Street property from Daigle's floor covering. So now this first mile portion is a rail trail. So that occurred in 2005, and we began having hikes along the railroad. Then in 2011, the town of Manchester bought this portion south of Middle Turnpike for $107,000 from Overland Manchester LLC. I know it looks a little bit snowy in that picture, but when the town bought that portion south of West Middle Turnpike, it did a fabulous job fixing up. It was so eroded, the trail, it was just almost washing away. The town did a terrific job with that. And then the second picture down on the left is the excavation of the railroad embankment, and the bottom right, bridge and trail improvements that we're finishing up in June of 2015. And this, in September of 2018, the town bought that final portion between Center Street and the Cheney Mills, including the trestle from Ken Bergkamp. And it's unbelievable how that looks today. It's just a park. It's a beautiful park. It was so overgrown there. It was just dump. It was a dump. There were people just throwing stuff in there. So now you can walk across that bridge, the trestle, and in fact, I loved it so much that I wrote a letter to the editor of the Journal Inquirer. That's what's on the right there. What a terrific job the town did in not just purchasing, planning, but executing this beautiful park. So your hike options for seniors, especially for seniors, you can get out and you can get out on this trail. It's wide enough to social distance. The top picture is the north end, where there's a bank and there's a CVS. It's like a strip mall. In the background, you can kind of see the elderly housing. And you can park there and walk from the north end. Or you could park at Hilliard Street. That's Daigle flooring there at Hilliard Street. Oops. And you can park at Center Springs Park. There's a little parking on Broad Street. And the bottom picture, I'm not suggesting that you park there. That's actually the parking for the apartments that were made from the silk mills. But you're looking down, look down to the south end. You could park at Cheney Hall, the parking lot there. You'd probably find a place to park and enjoy your walk along the Cheney Railroad. So now, Missy, I don't know if you need to do anything to switch over, but the town also has some plans for the future, and we're fortunate to have Jeff LaMalva. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Susan. That was a very interesting presentation.
Oh, thank you. One of my favorite topics, the Cheney Railroad.
Let me just share my screen. Before we talk about what's coming up, I just kind of wanted to very quickly recap this section that we've been working on over the last 2 years. And as you said, it goes from the new bridge that was built in 2015 at Edgerton Street down to that parking lot at 91 Elm Street. From the town's perspective, it was a very collaborative effort, both in funding and in construction. A lot of times on projects like this, we don't get the money right up front, so we have to do a phased approach to this. So the piece from Forest Street, or from 91 Elm Street, working north, southerly end, up to the Center Street Bridge, that was done entirely with town public works employees. They did all of the work. They did all of the clearing, the building of the trail, the landscaping, everything that you see out there today. Mm. And that was done using actually a grant from the Community Development Block Grant. It's a federal housing grant. So they were able to take advantage of that. And as you can see, and as Susan mentioned, it's a very nice, a lot of clearing was done, so it's a very wide open trail, very easy to walk. Obviously with the lack of rain, you can see the grass is not growing in the best, but hopefully that will turn soon. The section from the bridge, and including the bridge, the Trestle Bridge over Center Street North, that was done with contracted forces. We had to do an engineer design for that because of the terrain. The terrain was pretty steep as you crossed that bridge, and you could only get a very small walking path through there. This picture on the right shows the construction of the walking surface. What it is, it's an actual, it's a fiber reinforced concrete. It's very lightweight. And that was used to put on top of the steel trestle. And that's what you walk over. And it's a very safe surface to walk over. And then finally, once you get up north of that is the section between Center Street Bridge and Center Springs Park. You can see here is what we had to do. We actually had to build some retaining walls to be able to level the earth off to be able to get a nice 8-foot wide walking path.
What kind of wall?
That is we call it a segmental block wall. It's a retaining wall, and it comes in blocks, precast concrete blocks.
Oh,
And I think that the highest is about 4 feet. So, but in the end, what was ended up with, you have a continuous path now that, 8 feet wide, very, people can, like you said, social distance or ride a bike and walk at the same time. So anyway, now getting into the what's new, what's coming up. The first thing I want to talk about is the southernmost point that Susan talked about. Right now, the trail terminus is in a parking lot to the 91 Elm Street. We actually have an easement. We had one, the town had one all along this, I don't want to call it a roadway, it's more like a driveway that leads out to Forest Street. But the easement was actually over more to the west. What we came up with a concept is to work with, and we're actually very close to finalizing that, working with the owner of the property is to connect with a walking path and a sidewalk all the way out to Forest Street.
wow.
And relocating some of their parking over to the back here, kind of to give a separation between the actual trail and actually bring that trail directly out to Forest Street. So we're hoping that final negotiation with the owner happens very soon, and we're hoping to get this built this fall. If things kind of don't happen with the property owner as soon as we thought, it could be next spring.
Mm. Well, it's amazing, and especially that cooperation with the apartment owners. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, it's
Benefit to them as well.
Exactly, it's a win-win. Right now, unfortunately, their dumpsters are right at the trail entrance. It's not the prettiest.
No, no.
So, the goal is to get those over behind the parking lot, put up some landscaping, some screening, so that it is a pleasurable walk from Forest Street all the way up.
Hmm. Hmm.
Some of the other things that we're thinking of doing, some of them are, I believe, funded in the next budget. Others are not, but one of them, and this is Chris Silver, was our director of Parks and Recreation and Leisure and Family, came up with the idea of some murals. This is looking south at the Park Street Bridge. There's a kind of a large concrete wall over to the on the southwest corner of the bridge. It's a perfect blank canvas for a nice mural that will incorporate the Cheney silk, the historic surroundings. And then along the bridge itself, along the concrete, or I believe they're steel girders of the bridge, is to put up another decal sign along that kind of gives you the impression that, it's an entrance to the historic landmark district. Some of the other things are, we're looking to do some kind of a structure, a shade structure where you can either park your bike or sit on some benches overlooking the area that used to be, Susan, help me with this, was this the cold storage area? It's up near the Park Street Bridge where we uncovered those big granite walls.
Oh,
I believe it was a cold storage for the Cheney.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. So, when we cleared all that debris out of there, the beautiful granite walls, and they're out there right now. In that area, we're looking to do some kind of I don't want to call it a park. The intent is to keep a very natural looking, corridor here, but something that, some landscaping, maybe some sitting areas. So again, the shade structure, I don't show it on this rendering, but the tracks come right along through here.
Mhm.
So it kind of reminded me of like almost like a little depot stop. And that, we'll try to incorporate something that, that has that feel.
Mm. Beautiful.
So those are the additional amenities. The other thing that we are working on, it's a little bit more challenging, is some kind of a connection up to Park Street.
Oh, for people to go downtown?
Yes, yes.
Great. That's a great idea.
Or for people that live up in the neighborhoods up above to come down to the trail.
Mm.
So it's very steep. Unfortunately, it's probably going to have to be a combination of steps and ramps, but we're looking at the northeast corner of the bridge, coming down from there and creating some kind of a connection up.
That's a great idea.
So, those are the things that we're working on. As I said, I believe the murals and the bridge decorations are funded in next year's budget, so you may see those before the end of the year.
Excellent.
Some of the other things, it'll either be, if it's not the end of this year, it would be probably early next year. But, we're continued phasing and, adding amenities as we can get funding for them. But we're always open to suggestions, so.
It's wonderful. Manchester has done such a terrific job with its parks. And this one connects parks and history. And I know that people are using the trail. Well, we lead a lot of hikes there. In the winter, you can see their footprints in the snow. They're coming from Homestead Street. They're going to the CVS. They're going to Whiten Library. And so I think here they'll be coming out of the apartments and maybe going down to Subway or whatever. And it's just a wonderful and unique asset of the town of Manchester. I've learned a lot from your presentation too, Jeff. I didn't realize how much went into that work behind Shaw's, where Shaw's used to be. But that was in very eroded condition.
Definitely.
Mm. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Missy to switch back over to my slides. And maybe you'll come on one of our hikes, Jeff, when this pandemic goes over.
I will. I came on one, but that was before the bridge was completed.
Well, and you'll say thank you to all the people through Public Works who put their backs to this work. It really shows.
I will.
Thank you, Jeff. Come back to a little bit more about the Manchester Land Conservation Trust. Jeff mentioned the town had got grants. Well, the Land Trust got grants as well in doing trail improvements over the years. We had money from the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, the SBM Charitable Foundation, and the Manchester Road Race Committee. You might not think of this as a road race kind of place, but people train on the Cheney Railroad. They run, especially before Thanksgiving. You might want to take a look out there and you'll see people getting ready for the Manchester Road Race. So we always appreciate grants, but a lot of our funding comes from individuals who join as members to support us or give donations, or our volunteers who are working on the trails. This picture on the upper left is at the north side of West Middle Turnpike. So those of you who've lived here a long time, I'll say Vic's Pizza. It's near Vic's Pizza. You know how you give a description of where something is by a business. Shady Glen, it's out near Shady Glen. Anyway, that was Home Depot who came and fixed up what was really kind of not a parklet, it was more of a mess right there, and they planted some arborvitae that they donated. We also had grants for, I think it's called pea stone. It's not gravel, it's the type of covering that you can then press down. So this isn't paved. The Cheney Railroad isn't paved here. This particular spot is just south of Woodland Street. It's not paved, but you can ride a bike on it. You could bring a wheelchair on it. You could run a baby carriage along it. It's solid enough for that, although it isn't paved. The Land Trust doesn't own any heavy equipment, so if we get a grant, we might rent some heavy equipment, or we might hire somebody, or maybe somebody will donate their work. And we've had that happen as well. We love to run our rail trail walks, which we usually do about 5 or 6 times a year. Of course, right now, we haven't been gathering up in crowds of 50, 60. We've had 100 people come on our walks in good weather. And we will get back to that again. This is showing the bridge over Bigelow Brook. That's near Broad Street in Center Springs Park. A lovely spot for looking out over the Center Springs Park. The pond, by the way, wasn't built until 1921. So when I say that the Cheney Railroad looked out, it looked out over more of just a brook or a swamp until 1921, when the pond was dammed up. The park itself, 55 acres in the center of town, 55 acres of urban park, was donated to the town of Manchester by Cheney Brothers, and some land by E.E. Hilliard of Hilliard Mills. You can find more info about our Land Trust walks via our Facebook page or at Meetup. Sometimes we put our hikes out at meetup.com. They're free, they're always free, or they're in the newspaper. We have a little e-blast that goes out with an e-newsletter about once a month. But there's not much to report right now as far as hikes. So we're talking about the future when things settle down. You can find lots of information at the Dodd Library up at UConn and at the manchesterhistory.org. I've mentioned the Historical Society's website. I'm the webmaster, but I don't get paid, so I don't feel that I'm speaking out of turn to say it does have a lot of information about the Cheney Railroad and other parts of town, Aples Opera House, all kinds of wonderful history in the town of Manchester. The two really foundational histories of Manchester, one was written in 1923, which was the centennial of Manchester. We were incorporated in 1823. Before then, as a part of East Hartford, we didn't have our own history, so to speak. And then in 1973, which was our 150th anniversary, a New England pattern came out that was written by William E. Buckley. So these are two wonderful resources for people who want to bone up on the history of Manchester. The entire Speece and Bidwell history is online on our website. Now that was a labor of love by the grandson of Matthias Speece. He actually scanned the pages of his grandfather's, well, co-authored by his grandfather book. And Matthias Speece was especially interested in the Native Americans. And back in the era of an interest in all things colonial and even older than colonial, the prehistory of Manchester. He did a lot of investigating and archaeological work. He was looking for artifacts. He was looking for arrowheads, and made a map, actually, of the tribes of Connecticut, including the Podunks and Mohegans, etc. We're coming up, of course, on the 200th anniversary of Manchester. So that's kind of what's new in Manchester. Maybe we'll find some more interesting things, including, as I mentioned, the digitization of the Manchester Heralds. We'll be able to look up more history. It's not new history, it's just newly available to us to find out more. Getting back to the Cheney Railroad itself, the Manchester Land Conservation Trust, of course, has a very deep interest in the railroad, having purchased that first linear mile back in 2005. And the Manchester Historical Society, very interested. The railroad goes right by the headquarters of the Manchester Historical Society, which is on the corner of Forest and Pine Street. And the Rotary Club is also interested in the Cheney Railroad, and I'm just holding up this map, and how it relates to Charter Oak Park, the East Coast Greenway, going up to Bolton Notch, coming over on the Hop River Trail. And this is going to be the second year they're going to try to do that celebration of the all ability trails. All ability. So we should all be able to get out there, whether we're using our sneakers or a bicycle, a wheelchair, a baby carriage, to get out there and enjoy this unique asset of Manchester. Thanks for your kind attention for this recording today of our story about the South Manchester Railroad. Susan Barlow, signing off.